If you've been following my channel, you know most of my instructional videos have been with tabletop epoxy using multicolors or thin layered epoxy, I'll call it. So that's usually tabletop epoxy. Much of my knowledge and skills has come from my friend and mentor Shane Peters at Shane's Hardwood LLC. As you know, we've done a couple Q&As. But lately, I've been venturing into quite a bit more river charcuterie style epoxies, which is a thicker pour. And so I'll typically use something called art epoxy from O'Loggins, or deep pour epoxy I've used from Moss before. Also deep pour from Ultra Clear. I'll show you those bottles, or a couple of those bottles here in a second. And that's what's needed if you're going to pour greater than 1/4 of an inch, because if you don't use the right kind of epoxy, the curing won't be appropriate. And sometimes I might even use a combination of the two, like I did with a wine board that I built, where I poured a tabletop epoxy for the first layer, and I planted some corks in it. Let me show you that board up in the corner. I think it might be in this corner over here. So in that case, I used a combination of epoxies, both tabletop to lay down the first layer. Then I used the O'Loggins art epoxy to cover the wine corks. First I put in the wine corks, and then I used the O'Loggins epoxy to cover the wine corks, and then I polished everything. So I decided that it's time for me to make an instructional set of videos on how to do river charcuterie. Now, I know there's a gazillion of them out there, so hopefully I'll add a couple pieces of knowledge to you, and I'm going to teach them in my style, where I go through the process from A to Z on how you could put a river charcuterie board together. Now, you may see different shirts and different outfits and even different boards in this series of videos, because I've been filming the work all the way along, but I've been having too much fun doing the river charcuteries to actually sit down and put a video together. So now I'm going to take a collection of those videos, edit them together, and try to turn it into an instructional series, which is not as much about showing off the boards as showing how you do each part of the process. So let's go ahead and get started with the instruction. One of the differences between my multi-layer epoxy is the type of epoxy I use. When I'm doing multi-layer or thin epoxy coats or carving into epoxy, I'm using tabletop epoxy, which is good up to 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch at the most. When I'm doing river charcuterie, depending on how thick the epoxy is, I have different types of epoxy I can use. The epoxy I've been using lately is this O'Loggins epoxy. It's a 1:1 mixture ratio, and it's good for up to an inch is what they advertise. Jake there at O'Loggin, and I've actually used it that way, and it seems to work pretty well. I've been happy with the results. If I'm going to go up to 2 inches or so, I'll typically use ultra clear epoxy, deep pour epoxy extreme. Someone will ask, well, what makes you decide which epoxy you're going to use? Do you have a favorite brand? The answer is no, I don't have a favorite brand at this time. I have no brand loyalty. I do have some affiliate codes, and I have some coupon discount codes for some of the epoxies that I'll mention along the way. I'll put them in. But to be totally honest with you, all of the epoxies seem to perform the same so far. Now, I'm not saying I've been doing it for 20 years, as you know. I've been doing the river charcuteries for about a year now. And to me, the epoxies have been pretty close with how they work. So I typically will get whichever epoxy fits my needs, and based on what their sale price is and how cheap I can get them, I'll get that. I've also used Upstart Deep Pour, which worked well, and I've used Moss Deep Pour epoxy, and that worked well on board. So those are all brands that I have used. So if you're looking for a brand recommendation, I don't really have one. Use what you find works for you, and what you can find on sale is my opinion relative to brands of epoxy. The tools that I'm going to use when I'm making a river charcuterie are less onerous or less sophisticated than we're using when we make multi-layer epoxy boards. When I make a multi-layer epoxy board, I need to have a CNC with good accuracy that has a good XY location, and if all that's foreign mumbo jumbo, that's okay, because this video isn't about that. But this process is so much more simple. In this process, all I really need is I need a slab of wood, and I need to prepare that slab of wood. For example, that slab of wood. I need a mold. In this case, I'm using a mold by Crafted Elements, a silicone mold. I can make my own molds out of melamine. I'll mention that a little bit in the series. And there's lots of videos out there that tell you how to do that. I need the wood. I need the mold. I need the epoxy. I need a few tools. After I have the slab, most people are wanting to do live edge slabs. The next thing I need to do is debark, take the bark off of that slab. People will ask me, well, why do you have to take the bark off? I like it. Well, you have to take it off for a couple different reasons. One is it's not adhered to the slab as tightly as it needs to be, and over time with wood expansion and other elements going on, if you leave the bark on there, when you put the epoxy river in there, eventually that board could separate out, crack right where the bark is meeting the wood. The other one is the bark has a tendency to let off more air bubbles, which are a challenge when you're pouring epoxy, is air coming out of the wood or the substrate, whatever you want to call it, and creating bubbles. And the other part is that debris from the bark could come loose during the process, creating some debris and other challenges inside your river. So when you're doing a river charcuterie table or epoxy board or whatever, you need to take off the bark completely. That means every part of it, all the way to where you're nice and clean and you don't have any fuzzies or anything. And I'm going to cover that in this series, and that becomes important. Of course, you don't have to, but then you're taking a risk, and you know what Dirty Harry said.
You've got to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk?
So that's the first step. The first step is to prepare the board by taking all the bark off. The next step then is to cut the board to your form size. So if you don't already have a form, then you need to build the form. If you're not going to purchase a form, you need to build it. So once you have the form, the next thing you're going to need to do is to figure out the average width of the channel or the river. Between the average channel width and the thickness of the board, you will be able to calculate the amount of epoxy needed for your pour. Once you've got that done, then the next step will be then to put a top coat, which is what you see going on with this board right here. I just seal coated. I said top coat. I'm seal coating the river. And I'm seal coating the river so that when I pour the river, I have less chance for air bubbles to be coming out and to allow the epoxy to adhere to. So after I seal the river and let it dry, I'll have to scuff up that river so that the other epoxy can adhere to the board. I put my seal coat on a little different than other people. I actually apply a seal coat to the whole board. And I do that as a holdover, I guess I would say, from my multicolor days where I had epoxy seep into the face grain or end grain and stain wood, and then I had to deal with that. So by me sealing both the top, the ends, the sides, everything, I remove the probability, or I make it almost zero, that I'm going to have colored epoxy that I'm pouring in the center actually get into the board. So that's my next step, is seal coating. After I've measured the average width, after I've seal coated, then I'm prepared for the pour. At that point, I'll go ahead and pour the board. I'll mix up the epoxy. I'll pour in. I'll talk about how I go about doing that in this series. And then after it's all poured, I do things like monitoring it for levelness afterwards to make sure it hasn't shifted. Look for leaks, address leaks, take care of them. And once everything's cured, then I go through the process of surfacing the board. And I can do that either with a planer, CNC, a router sled. There's a number of ways I can surface this board, but the goal is to get it nice and flat. And the normal process for most people that don't have a CNC or other sophisticated tools is to put it through a planer. There's all kinds of ways you can go about it, but that's the next step, is to surface the board, get it nice and flat, and coplaner. And after you have it surfaced, then you go through the finishing process. And if you decide you want a really shiny board, You can put an overcoat on it or a flood coat. You can polish the resin portion of that board and get it shiny. And I actually have a video where I did a 2-color board where I poured a 1/4 inch or less of red tabletop epoxy and I planted corks in it. And then I filled the board up with clear epoxy. And to be able to have that clear epoxy nice and clear and to be able to look through the corks, I polished it. And I'll put a link to that video up in this corner. For those of you that are old enough to remember, we all remember what Porky Pig said, that's all, folks. So that's a wrap on the introduction to the video series. I think if you have been interested in learning how to do a river charcuterie board, this series will work out really well for you. I'm going to go through all of the different steps to build a river charcuterie board. This was just the introductory video. The next video that will be coming out is the debarking, as I said previous to this closing statements. If you think I deserve it, please give me a like with a thumbs up. That's always helpful with the channel. If you don't want to miss one of the steps as we go through the process, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. You can do that by, I think there's a little button over here that you can press. And that way you'll be informed, and if you turn on the bell, it'll tell you each time I release video. It shouldn't be that long. I've got most of the videos already put together. I'm just editing them. The next video, as I said earlier, will be the debarking video, and it will come out either the same day of this as this video or within 2 days of this video. It's just I got to see how the timing works best. Shortly after that, then will come the next set of videos. And it won't be weeks between videos, it'll be more like days. Maybe at the most a week between videos until I get the video series done. So again, hit the subscribe button. Thank you for watching the videos. I hope that they are helpful to you, and my goal is to make the learning process easier. And we've gotten through the multicolor epoxies, and I'll do more on that. But now we're going to go through the river charcuterie board process. And hope you have a lot of fun, and by the end you have yourself a river charcuterie board that you built yourself. Until we meet in this medium again, thank you for all the watching and the comments and the likes that you can give me. Take care.